Ever since we started grade school, we've all been told that we need a big, strong government to look after us. And that, sure, it may need fixing here and there, but generally today's government size is about right. We disagree. We think that government is a parasite, living off what you and I earn and using our money to do unpleasant things to us. From being a nation of self-reliant go-getters, America is fast becoming a country of government junkies. We think an alternative exists, one that puts you back in charge of your own life and destiny. We call it the freedom alternative.
Hello again and welcome back. This is the Freedom Alternative and I'm Jim Davies. Today our main subject is health care, the huge amount it costs you and me to insure for health care today and why it is so huge, and why in a free society, that's one in which the government plays no part at all, its quality would be better and its cost far lower. To help us look into that in a few minutes' time is our guest today, Dr. Alan Mencher, who has for many years been both a student and a patient of alternative health care. For our first few minutes, though, we're going to tie up a few loose ends from our program of 1 week ago. In case you were unable to watch us then, let me quickly remind you of its theme. We showed how the government agencies that collect taxes are routinely brutal, how they terrorize and even murder both people who resist them and people who happen to get in the way without ever meaning to resist. We showed the very recent and terrible example of the Weaver family of Idaho. Mr. Weaver's wife and 13-year-old son and all their dogs were shot dead by FBI agents and U.S. Marshals acting for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, the BATF. We showed you extracts from a recent Montel Williams show in which a couple related how an IRS raid had caused the loss of one of the twins they were expecting. And we recalled the case from our own files of Andrew Melichinsky of Enfield and how he had had his home stolen by the IRS. All these occurred without jury trials, as are required by the Bill of Rights. Instead of calling for reform of the IRS and other tax collection agencies, however, we called for their abolition. The reason was that we recognize that they are all doing only what they have to do to fulfill the utterly uncivilized task of stealing our money. Taxation is theft, and their job is to steal it. Since they are outnumbered 1,000 to 1, their only hope is to terrorize the population into voluntary compliance by allowing horror stories like these to become known. We have to admit it's been terribly successful. We then started to answer a couple of common knee-jerk objections to the idea of abolishing taxes. What about the poor? And wouldn't blood run in the streets? Walter Gengarelli gave us a splendid answer to the first of those. He showed that the federal government transfers about $760 billion a year from taxpayers to its favored recipients, but that, contrary to the government's big lie, that money does not go to the poor and needy. By the government's own figures, they number about 35 million people. So, by simple arithmetic, if that money were going to the poor, there wouldn't be any poor. They would all be receiving over $80,000 a year per family of 4. So, since the poor are not getting those tax dollars in the first place, they could not possibly be hurt if taxes were abolished. Rather conclusive proof, I think. But, Walter, we didn't have time to hear what you might say about the other common objection to abolishing taxes. Wouldn't blood run in the streets?
Well, Jim, it sounds like an extreme statement, but if tradition obtains, we actually would find that it probably would. Whether it's an extreme situation, as in the World War veterans who rioted because they wanted some of their pensions, and there was blood running in the streets in Washington in the, I believe it was in the 1920s, to school teachers that they'll go out on strike and close a school down right when kids are ready to go to school because they want a little bit more money. And what we're looking at is here, if this money we just discussed were transferred directly to the poor, some number that's a little tough to pick because of the information that the government puts out on what it's doing, but some number between 350 and 450,000 government workers would be put out of work. The people that count these folks and administer to them supposedly on monstrous budgets where the majority of the money is spent paying the people administering the program rather than benefiting the so-called poor that it's supposed to help. So yes, I would expect these people, for the most part, a good portion of them wouldn't want to go out and find honest work, and blood may very well run in the streets if those programs were closed down or if the money that was collected for the poor was just sent directly to the poor without going through these administrators.
Well, okay, Walter, so if these beneficiaries of our tax dollars might indeed go on a rampage and cause violence, maybe even conceivably civil war or something of that kind, isn't this one powerful argument for not abolishing taxation?
Well, it certainly isn't an argument for abolishing it unless you believe in extortion, because basically that's what these... Now, let's make sure who it is we're talking about.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the poor who aren't eating that money is going to. We're talking about the administrators of all these programs that are basically living on a job area that's been created by these welfare programs, and there wouldn't be a equivalent job in the private sector for these people.
Right.
Because
they'd
as
find
you
one.
know, well, some of them would find ones, especially those that are genuine. I don't want to paint all one group one way or another.
Right.
There are genuine helping agencies,
Oh, yeah.
the Salvation Army, most of the churches, and so forth, where their role would be expanded, and therefore there would be jobs available
Sure.
for people who were true helpers.
Sure.
But for people who have sort of who have been feeding at the government trough. I hate calling it the government trough, it's the taxpayer's trough.
Right.
The government put their name on it,
Yeah.
but the stuff in the trough comes from the taxpayer.
Every last penny of it.
Every last penny of it. And these folks are not going to want to go out and do something else. So it's a serious situation. And you have to remember, we've referred to a lot of these things. There's a lot of criteria that they establish that have excavated a lot of the problems that we've got. If there's two parents living in the home, they don't get as much payment, so it splits up families, and on and on and on and on. That wouldn't exist if these administrators didn't exist.
Would maybe I can suggest this, that the situation we have today is of a gang of thieves robbing productive people. It's accurate.
Oh yeah.
Now, we're saying that theft should stop. The consequence may be that some of the thieves get really nasty. Is that an argument for not stopping? I don't think so. You've got to do what's right. Would you agree with that?
Well, the sheriff of Nottingham got nasty, didn't he?
All right. Okay.
It's been going on for, this is not a new idea. This
Yeah,
is
right.
not a new concept. And
So
yes, still get nasty. We saw an example last week of where they were getting nasty because the source of income was threatened.
Yeah.
If the jobs themselves were threatened, it gets just as nasty.
Yeah.
The thing is that, I don't want to paint too black a picture, these people are spread out. There's a large concentration of them in Washington and state capitals, but they're spread out all over the place. They are living in undercover, you might almost say, in suburbs and so forth, alongside of people who have regular, honest jobs.
And don't let's forget that a lot of the recipients of taxpayer dollars are not people working in these anti-poverty programs, so-called, but they're corporations receiving largesse from the federal government particularly, in massive sums of money being transferred to people who are not poor at all. They will squeal for sure if it's taken away from them, but they're probably not the kind of people who will actually take weapons out on the streets and start
Oh,
cutting
no,
people's
absolutely. As a
throats.
matter of fact, if you remember a number of years ago, William Simon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury, wrote a book called A Time for Truth.
Oh, yeah.
And he pointed out how really insipid the system was, and how these people felt no shame in coming in and asking for millions and millions and hundreds of millions of dollars from the government to support
Farmers.
their particular industry. No, I'm not talking about farmers, I'm talking about
Corporations.
corporate
Yeah.
officers that were bringing down six-figure incomes
Right.
that didn't want to go out and compete,
Right.
and wanted the government to either protect them or give them a grant or buy something from them so that they could keep their company and job going. These are the worst welfare recipients of all, because they truly are robbing the people.
Yep. Well, Walter, thank you very much. Let's move on to our main theme for today.
Very good.
One more loose end to tie up from last week. At the very end, we told you that on November 3rd, there is one candidate for US President whose program does include the abolition of the IRS and the repeal of the personal income tax. An excellent first step towards total tax abolition. I said then that we were not allowed to tell you his name in the broadcast. Well, to my considerable surprise and pleasure, that public access rule has, in the last few days, been relaxed. The Connecticut Department of Utility Control has announced, following a challenge by the CCLU, that we producers of public access television programs are now indeed free, if we wish, to endorse candidates for public office. That to suppress such endorsement would be unconstitutional. So, right now, I'll tell you the good news. The candidate who will abolish the IRS, if elected, is Andre Marou, nominated by the third largest political party in the United States, the Libertarians. Let's show you a quick clip of the start of his acceptance speech at that convention last year, in which he made just that promise.
I'm looking forward to the next 14 months or so. I think we're going to do a lot better than anybody thinks we're going to do, as you are. As you know, the centerpiece of my campaign will be as follows: to repeal the income tax and abolish the IRS.
Well, Alan Mencher, welcome back to our program.
Nice
to see you.
Nice to be here.
I think all of us know that the cost of healthcare in America is appalling. The quality of it, well, it's often said to be the best healthcare system in the world, and maybe it does deliver the best healthcare that's available anywhere, but the cost is appalling. We know that intuitively. Even though those of us who have healthcare provided in our jobs by our employers may be shocked to learn this, which I heard on the radio yesterday. This concerns the large company General Motors. General Motors has been providing its employees with healthcare insurance as part of the benefits package. They changed it yesterday. Now a family of a GM employee will have to pay up to $5,000 in the year, first $5,000 instead of the first few hundred. Big change. And they mentioned this, that in the cost of every GM car that you and I might buy is $1,000 that is attributable to the cost of the healthcare insurance in GM. That's one measure of how expensive healthcare is. Alan, what does government do to increase the cost of healthcare? What are the main things it does?
Well, first of all, before I start that, Jim, I want to make sure our audience knows that I was introduced at the beginning of the program as Dr. Alan Mencher. I am not a medical doctor. I have a PhD in physics. I have no professional affiliation with the medical field whatsoever.
I think you're going to make that clear, aren't you?
Indeed. Except for a deep interest and study in alternative healthcare methods. What the government has a deep involvement. I have come to characterize some of these things as the politico-professional complex, which has to do with the interaction between the political process and the professional societies, the AMA in particular as far as medicine is concerned, and also what I call the politicization of disease, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But basically, of course, the AMA is a restraint of trade, monopolistic organization.
That's the American Medical Association, to which all doctors have to belong, is that right?
Have to belong. Well, I don't know that they have to belong, but they do.
Okay.
They have to, of course, be licensed, and it is a highly regulated profession, and it is monitored by the FDA, at least the pharmaceutical end of that.
Who licenses them?
Well, individual states license.
So state government.
State.
So I cannot practice medicine unless the state of Connecticut licenses me.
Oh, that's very true.
Even though you've got a doctorate in physics, you couldn't practice medicine, right?
Oh, it's quite irrelevant.
Okay.
It's quite irrelevant. And of course, they are extremely fastidious about keeping that, having a gatekeeper at that door.
Okay.
Because doctors pay an awful lot for their education, as we all know.
So what effect does this have on the cost of doctoring?
Well, first of all, they have a monopoly, and they are regulated by the FDA, and of course now with Medicare and Medicaid and all those kinds of things, prices are pretty well determined by an interaction between the medical profession and the government.
The prices of
medical
giving
care,
or, yeah, okay.
and what is allowed. Now, these days, you have, see, the greatest advances in medicine have not been by doctors in the medical area. They've been in biochemistry and they've been in electronics and engineering.
Okay.
And this has led to huge instruments, which are very, very expensive. And because of the huge litigation involved and the liability situation, we're paying an awful lot for that too.
Okay.
If that were cut out, and now I'm happy to say there is some talk of making some limitations on that $250,000 beyond cost for pain and suffering, which is at least they're talking about it. But that can be huge. And what the hospitals and doctors have to do is protect themselves against possible litigation, and therefore they go through every possible test that they can. Then, of course, there's the control of the drug situation by the FDA. Only under prescription, only allowed drugs can be prescribed, and there's this long, tremendous process by which a drug has to be tested and has to be approved. And as we were discussing before, the length of time, average length of time is about 12 years. The length of time for patent is 7 years. 17,
yeah,
sorry. That
right.
gives them 5 years of
Yeah,
working life
yeah.
for something that costs them hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know how much, because all the testing they're required to go through and so forth. Now, I don't say it isn't a good thing to keep frauds off the market, but at what cost? And aren't there other ways of doing it?
Yeah, indeed.
Then we've talked about equipment, hospital equipment and so forth, and the excessive use of that when it's was not needed. And then, of course, there's the research end of it. The government does control research, and that, as we will probably get on to later.
Yeah, I would like to. And that's a major cost element, isn't it, in healthcare?
Well,
Research,
I would say research isn't, it's a big one, but the bigger ones are just a huge cost of the type of treatment we have these days, and also the concept that we have to be inoculated against death. I mean, that's what the American public has been led to understand they could strive for. There is no such thing as a risk. Life is replete with risks from the moment you enter the world to the moment you leave it. That's the only place where you don't have it.
Let me come back briefly to the very first thing you mentioned there, that government prevents anybody practicing as a doctor and helping heal people unless he's got or she's got a government license to do so. And clearly this is, as you said, restrictive. It creates a monopoly. Anybody who'd like to compete with them at lower cost cannot do so. This is a big element in the cost. What, in your opinion, and I know you've got some experience with this, what, in your opinion, would be the kinds of medical care that might be available freely on the market, even advertised, if that restriction were removed, if anybody who wanted to could practice medicine and, of course, bear the responsibility for his actions?
Well, there are a lot, and in fact, it hasn't gotten down to the bottom line yet, because a lot of things are available. They, too, many of them, have to be licensed. And
like, for instance?
Well, naturopaths, for instance.
What was that?
Naturopaths, doctors of naturopathic medicine, which are natural remedies, so to speak. In their, which includes things like homeopathy, like herbal medicine, things like that. In the state of Connecticut and 3 other states, you have to be licensed to do that sort of thing.
Really? I didn't know.
Well, you know...
even if you have an unorthodox medical approach, like they do, unorthodox, all right, you know, unusual, you still have to get a government license?
Well, in order to practice medicine, if you are construed as practicing medicine in whatever it is you do with people, if you advise them or refer them to certain medications or remedies or whatever, and you imply that this is going to cure their situation, that's a no-no. You can, however, educate them but where that line is drawn is very difficult to say.
I can see bureaucrats getting into that one and making a lot of money over it. But Alan, are these other kinds of medicine, some people will say, well, this is just quackery. We don't need that anyway. Are they any good? Do they bring results? I believe you've got some experience on that.
Well, I do. And one of the problems there, Jim, is that it's how you decide whether something is effective or not. Mm-hmm. The medical profession has its standard way of practicing its, if you want to call it a science. It's more an art than a science. It's more a book of rules. You know, you find out what the disease is, and then you know there are certain prescribed medications that can be applied to that. And a lot of doctors learn a lot of what they know from the drug manufacturers and from salesmen who have gotten maybe 6 weeks training. Okay. And that's very ludicrous, really, for a man who's spent 12, 15 years, whatever it is, learning his profession to put so much emphasis on what a salesman
kid fresh out of college.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you're pointing out the weaknesses of orthodox medicine, fair enough, but what about, say, for instance, the homeopathic doctor? Have you got an experience of that kind of medicine, and does it work?
Well, in my opinion, it certainly works very well for a lot of people. In fact, it could work for everybody. It's just that you have to take responsibility for your own health. See, that's one of the in this program you're showing people that they have to take responsibility for their own lives.
Absolutely.
It's the same thing in anything in life. That's the pattern of nature. That's the way the world was formed. And there's no different in this. Somebody who wants to take up the treatment, homeopathic treatment, should know something about what the principles are, how they work, because a lot of it can be done at home, first aid treatments, and the cost could be cut by huge, huge amounts.
Okay, Alan. Let's move on now to the other main area of our discussion, research. I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that government very much controls the way and the content of original research into the causes of various diseases like cancer and AIDS, and though this may not be a huge element in the total cost of healthcare, it's an enormously important one in terms of how good it is now and in the future. Am I right that it does do that controlling?
Well, it has large amounts of funds administered through the National Institutes of Health, and of course the National Institutes of Health, which have a lot of sub-bodies in them, do a great deal of research on government money of their own. This is a very prestigious organization. It's very well known. But I was talking before about the politicization of disease, and I call that something that has three qualities in it, three categories, and that is you can't suffer from a disease that isn't recognized. So if the disease isn't recognized, nobody's going to fund it, and that's happened. I mean, for instance, hypoglycemia still is not recognized as a malfunction by a lot of the medical profession. You cannot be cured by an unauthorized treatment, and that's where some of the other alternative medical factors get involved, and disease cannot be caused by an unauthorized agent. And that, of course, brings us right over to in the middle of the AIDS situation.
Now, an enormous amount of attention, obviously, and rightly, is going on to AIDS. It's a very, very serious problem in today's society. Is there a question mark over the kind of research that is being done?
A very serious one. I was amazed to learn, which I learned maybe a couple of years ago, that there was because I don't follow these that closely, very serious question about whether the HIV, the HIV virus, which is alleged to cause AIDS, is in fact the agent which transmits the disease.
Oh, now, but everybody knows that. The Surgeon General says it does.
Indeed. I have a friend who started smoking when the Surgeon General said smoking is bad for your health, because he said the Surgeon General has been wrong in everything else. He's certainly doing wrong on this. So much for that. But
is this a serious question, that HIV does not cause AIDS, perhaps?
Well, isn't it serious if we're off on the wrong track?
It sure is. Are we on the wrong track?
Well, I'm not there to say yes or no, but I can say that there's a lot of evidence that it is. First of all, there's a book called AIDS and Syphilis, The Hidden Link, by Harris Coulter, who was a person who was a medical historian, very well equipped to do this kind of work. Mm-hmm. It's got 250 independent references to all kinds of types of documentation that you might want to know. And then recently, and not as long ago as 1988, there was an article in Atlantic Monthly magazine about this subject. And recently, I got interested in it again because there's a magazine that's called Spin.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's got the HIV myth, new evidence that it doesn't cause AIDS. Now that's, that is just unaccepted. What is it? So I'll just quote you here what it says. In a deadly conspiracy of silence, the medical establishment is ignoring powerful evidence that HIV does not spread sexually and may in fact be harmless. Now this is quite a statement. And
sure
this would not appear in a magazine like this without some backup, and in fact it's here.
But virtually all AIDS research is based on the presumption that it is caused by
Indeed.
HIV. And if therefore this line of thinking were correct, all of it would be a waste.
Well, it would be a waste, but look at the vested interest and look at why it is unlikely in the near future to be, the facts to be recognized that this case it is unlikely that this case will be given any hearing. Because what do we have? We have in Dr. Robert Gallo of the National Institutes of Health, we have a man who is a co-discoverer of the AIDS virus. Now, there are circumstances surrounding his discovery which are in question, but we need not go into that now. He happens to have patents on AIDS detection, on HIV detection in patients. And this is led to detection kits which sell quite a bit. Now, ordinarily, a person like that, in a situation like that, would be in severe conflict of interest.
He certainly would.
But that doesn't seem to be considered anymore.
So here is one person, at least, where he's got a direct personal interest in continuing the promotion of the view that AIDS is caused by HIV, and yet he's in charge of, or virtually in charge of, the disposition of taxpayers' money on its research. Am I correct?
On a lot of it. In fact, he was head of AIDS research. This book, of course, is dated, and I don't know if things have changed since then, but at least that certainly was the case, and he certainly still is a prominent actor in the scene. Now, on the other hand, the people who are probably have more credentials, medical credentials in AIDS and retroviruses are silenced. There's a Dr. Peter Duesberg who is acknowledged as the leading expert in retroviruses. And he had, I have to get this to you.
We have unfortunately, the clock against us.
Okay.
Let me just say that you've just opened a can of worms, and I think we're going to be back to this subject before very long. Thank you very much for joining us, Alan. Fascinating subject. We will return to it. Incidentally, we mentioned earlier in the program Andre Marou, the libertarian running for president. His running mate is Nancy Lord, a doctor of both medicine and law. Join us next week on The Freedom Alternative when we shall celebrate our 100th edition. Don't miss it. Until then, have a good week.